Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Francesca. I'm the current president of Social Enterprise Club at Columbia Business School. I'm honored to introduce you to this all-ladies panel today. The panel is Empowering Refugees Through Financial Inclusion, Unlocking Economic Potential. Our moderator is Inara Tareque. And then we have, she's a PhD candidate at Columbia Business School. And with her, we have Sarah Khalbuss, program specialist at Refugee Career Development at HIAS, Yanki Tshering, executive director and founder at Accompany Capital, and Selen Ucak, entrepreneurship and strategy lead at the Refugee Investment Network. Join me in welcoming them today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and again, welcome to our panel. We're so excited to have all of you join us today, and we are also really thrilled to have three amazing panelists join us who are such experts in what they're doing with empowering refugees. And with the global refugee crisis, which has risen unprecedented levels with over 100 million people displaced worldwide, this is a really important topic to talk about. And this staggering number and the scale of the refugee crisis is not only something we should support for humanitarian purposes, but there's also an immense reservoir of untapped resources that a lot of people can benefit from supporting in terms of both innovation and also in terms of improving economic participation and growth that benefits both refugees as well as host society. So with that in mind, it's again my pleasure to welcome these amazing distinguished panelists who are making profound strides in empowering refugees. So I would just love to open the panel up with my first question, which is about your journey towards refugee empowerment. So I would love to know about how, if you could share like a little bit of your details about what inspired you to work in this field of refugee empowerment and economic inclusion. So maybe I'll start with Sarah and then circulate.
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. So I'm the daughter of Syrian immigrants, and my identity has meant a lot to me my whole life. When I entered college, right around then, the Arab revolutions began, and I entered sociology knowing that I wanted to study those social movements. But in my second year of college, I also began to volunteer with refugees. There was an organization at Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, called Keep It Real. And we did home visits, we rented cars, we drove to Somali Bantu refugee families' houses, and we helped out with homework, we helped parents with, small things that they need done, doctor's appointments, that kind of thing. So that took my whole heart throughout the entire time I was in college. I was also writing about the Arab revolutions that later became civil wars in some countries, including Syria, and then later became refugee crises. So by the end of my time, Syria was seeing a refugee crisis. So I applied for a Fulbright. I knew I wanted to do Fulbright. I love teaching. Teaching was my thing. So I applied to the Fulbright teaching program in Turkey. And funnily enough, I'd studied Arab studies, Middle Eastern politics, sociology of the Middle East, but really didn't look at Turkey much. But when I applied, I definitely knew I wanted to kind of go there because I knew a lot of Syrians were ending up there. So got my Fulbright, and I ended up by surprise in a city across from Istanbul. It's called Yalova. There are no placements in Istanbul for this program, so I was very lucky to be close to this major city that was a refugee city as well. And so midway through my Fulbright, I actually met someone who's also a Fulbright, an Iranian American, and we had very similar stories, Iranian American, Syrian American who want to work with refugees. And we decided to start a nonprofit. So we decided to co-found Istanbul and I, a social inclusion and service nonprofit, because we really found that Turks and non-Turks, like everyone living in Istanbul, students alike, they want to get involved on these topics, but they don't know how. So that's what we thought we wanted to do. So we opened our nonprofit, we opened our doors about a year into starting up. And yeah, I would say that that adventure for the 3-4 years that I was leading this nonprofit startup in a xenophobic situation in a country that was, having a lot of tension on this topic was such an amazing and beautiful time, and also a very challenging time. And yeah, running a very community-centered nonprofit, like startup kind of mentality, was also amazing and also challenging, right? Because everyone has opinions about how things go, and it was a very tense environment as well. But yeah, we did beautiful things. We did an unaccompanied minors project. We worked with LGBTQ refugees in a homeless shelter. We were doing such beautiful work. And then I decided to further my graduate studies, and I applied to Columbia, which got me to New York very recently. So, 5 years ago, I came to New York for Columbia, got a scholarship. Thank God, they love founders. I went to SIPA and did my studies there and just deepened my knowledge of livelihoods and refugee issues, but also project management and nonprofit management. And I ended up at HIAS, which is the Jewish humanitarian agency that runs one of the 10 resettlement agencies that run refugee programming.
Thank you so much. That's such a fascinating.
Hey, can I go?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, you guys? Yeah. So anyway, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here, another SIPA graduate. So my parents were, I see someone waving, I don't know who it is. But anyway, my parents were Tibetan refugees, and in the late 50s, we had a home in India, North India. I don't know, I'm sure most of you have heard of Darjeeling, or even if you haven't heard of Darjeeling, you've drunk Darjeeling tea. It's a town that's very well known for its tea gardens. So I grew up in the next town, Kalimpong. So my parents, fortunately for them, when they had to flee Tibet, I won't go into the political details, but anyway, so we had a home in India, and India was very welcoming. They opened their doors and let Tibetan refugees come in. So I settled in the small town, and I was always surrounded by people who created their own jobs. And I think, I've always had a deep respect for entrepreneurs, whether they were baking bread at home and you went into their kitchen and there were 30 people lining up to buy bread from them, or the milkman who came and, delivered milk. So anyway, that was my sort of the foundation for my early appreciation of entrepreneurship. And then in India, what was obvious, it's a very, very competitive environment. So as soon as I could, I saved some money. I said, I'm going to get the hell out of here because I'm not going to be able to compete with all these brilliant Indian students. Even the postman had like 2 master's degrees. So I only had enough money to get to London. So I bought my ticket, and then I was living in Nepal then, much more international than India because, they do allow many tourists to come in, many people who come to Kathmandu, tourists, very, very international environment, which I loved, but I also felt there's not enough opportunity there. I need to go to the West. So I had a sack of clothes. These were all clothes made with old saris, like hippie pants and tops. So for about 2 months, I had a stall at Camden Market. I made enough money, and then I came to New York. And fortunately for me, I got a scholarship to go to SIPA. So what SIPA did for me was give me that piece of paper that I needed to found Accompany Capital. It's a CDFI. We started with a grant of 15,000, and currently we have assets of 28 million. So I'm going to stop there.
Hi, everyone. So I came to this space of refugee economic inclusion via actually. So I'm a Columbia Business School alum, and I worked in various sort of capacities in the social impact sector. But then about 9 years ago, I got involved with an international development organization called Building Markets, which was at the time getting ready to launch a program in Turkey geared for SMEs founded by Syrians in Turkey. And based on my sort of previous work with local private sector in Turkey, I got involved with them, and we did a market assessment together of what these Syrian-owned SMEs' experience was and what their needs were, and how this organization that supported SMEs from around the world could also do that for the Syrian-owned SMEs in Turkey. And then after that market assessment, I led that program there in Turkey, along with another one in Jordan. And about 3 years ago, I joined Refugee Investment Network to sort of move the topic for me from the enterprise side to the capital side of then how do we, fund enterprises like this? How do we also bring more private sector and private capital into the space where enterprises like the ones we supported through building markets could flourish? And I guess what sort of inspired me to continue to do this work, starting with that initial market assessment, was just seeing the enormous potential, as you were saying, Nara, at the beginning. A lot of needs, of course, but these SMEs that we were working with in Turkey and then in Jordan, were also making tremendous economic contributions. And it was clear that, they needed more support at the same time. So that's, how I kept going, and I'll tell you more about what I do now throughout the panel, but that's it for now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And actually, that's a great segue, because I really would love to hear all three of your thoughts around, from your work, what are some of the significant barriers, be it financial or be it kind of social barriers that you have seen refugees face, and how do you have examples or like best practices in terms of how you have empowered refugees, and why should we even think about empowering refugees beyond, again, being humanitarian, but what is kind of the investment perspective on that? So maybe we'll start with Yanki and then Selen and then Sarah, to mix up the order. Yeah.
Is it on? Yes. So I'm just coming from a conference in Los Angeles. There's a trade association for CDFIs called Opportunity Finance Network. And it was amazing and it was so exciting because there's a lot of opportunity for CDFIs. So immigrants and refugees face many, many barriers. But at the end of the day, the session that I was a speaker on, what we came to the conclusion, it's good business. All our clients, we've made over 70 million in loans, and we have very low delinquency rates. And it's not because we're so good at what we do, because we are lending to the most vulnerable, but they are so excellent at trying their best to make payments. So in terms of getting back to your question, I want to stay on track. So the challenges are many. And, so we had to build a team, and combined we speak, I would say, 14 languages and dialects. And what we realized early on is it's actually in our interest to employ people from various communities that we knew we would get many clients from, and actually train them. Because not only were we hiring people who had the language competency, but also the cultural competency, but we were also investing in communities, because they in turn were going and strengthening those communities, because maybe they go, to their mosque or to their church, and they're considered an expert and able to get advice on how do you build credit, or what is a predatory loan. So there are many, many challenges, but at the end of the day, with the right education, with the right staffing, we have been able to build a very, very successful CDFI. And the other thing good about CDFIs, I'm sure many of you are thinking about, what's the next step? The salaries are actually very competitive with mainstream for-profit banks, credit unions. So because of that, I'm actually seeing more and more men, joining the CDFI sector. So before it was a lot of women who wanted to do good. But what I always tell people is, you can also do well, by joining a CDFI. So I don't know if I answered your question, but anyway, let's give someone else a turn.
Sure, thank you. Selen?
Yeah, the barriers. I mean, it's very sort of context specific too, because it depends on the policy, environment, the regulations around, displaced people being able to start a business, or, their right to work, access to opening, bank accounts, access to credit, things like that, which, you can study from context to context. They show some similarities. Some environments are better than others. But then there are also the sort of the de facto barriers as well, even when something, is written in a certain way in the law, so the regulatory environment is conducive to refugees starting a business or getting credit or opening a bank account. In practice, it may not be, the case, and that's where sort of like the prejudices or, risk aversion of the financial institutions or the private sector in general, those types of things come into play. And then, of course, as any, newcomer might experience, just sort of familiarity with the local, business environment, lack of networks, even in Turkey, for example, Syrian entrepreneurs with the language barriers as well, experiencing challenges with finding qualified professional service providers, the lawyers, the accountants, etc., to be able to support those businesses. So, all kinds of barriers can exist, but I can't wait to talk about the opportunities aspect of it as well.
Perfect, thank you. And
I'm really glad to be on this panel because I love the refugee business side of the work. Like I have my Syrian relatives in Turkey own small businesses, and it's a game changer for their children and for them. I'm actually working on the career development side in the resettlement system, in the U.S. resettlement program. So it's a very sort of different types of barriers. So we're talking about employment and actually growing in your employment, potentially re-entering maybe a career path. Maybe you were a doctor or an engineer. So the barriers for us, so the programming we do is a lot of career counseling, but it's a lot of skills development. And the biggest barriers we identified are English language. And it's like the truth and the reality that if you want to work, especially if you want to work, in a growing role, in a manager role, or anything like that, you're going to need, or a client-facing role, you're going to need English. And the ESL world is just not great. There's a lot of good things happening right now, but in terms of like what refugees can access, like it's very basic. It's very, think about like basic grammar and stuff and like how long it will take to get you to a point where you can maybe do a job interview. So we really focus on ESL. That's probably the number one. Digital literacy, digital skills are huge. In every part of your integration, you need digital skills. So very much like, obviously in the employment side, applying and even interviewing is going to be Zoom most likely, all that. But then when you're working, there will be internal software systems, emails, and everyone knows that refugees have cell phones and that they're good at WhatsApp and texting, but there's a little bit of a difference with like professional emailing, Teams chat, and all of those types of things. And then I want to also just remind everyone that when people come to the US, no matter what their amazing experiences are, for the most part, if you don't, what matters is your experience in the US. Like, as soon as you start developing your experience in the US, that's when your resume starts to be something more appealing to an employer. Because think about it, all the soft skills you need, the cultural competency to work on a team is also something that takes some time, and it usually would require some time on your resume, basically. And so the reminder I want to make is that when you're early in your resettlement process and you didn't bring capital with you, which is most people that we work with, you're usually in a state of somewhat, closer to poverty, basically poverty level. So, you're on public benefits in some cases. So what I mean is there's so many other barriers that are occurring, like challenges with childcare, for example, or health problems and getting the healthcare you need, and the worries about that and the stresses about navigating that system. So these are racialized folks. There's a lot of isms that are against them right now. They've got lots of children, and they're putting all their time towards work. And then we're also asking them to put some time towards career development, vocational training, studying English. So time is actually one of the biggest barriers, I would say. Yeah.
Just reminded me. So the thing with refugees, immigrants, and many of the people we work with, they may be classified as immigrant, but technically they don't have, they're very similar to someone who's classified as a refugee. So that was something we had to learn early on. So initially we started with a grant of $15,000 from American Express to start the program. As I mentioned, we didn't tell people it was $15,000. We created a very nice flyer and we said, funded by American Express Foundation, and people were very impressed. But one thing I have to say about refugees and immigrants, they're very practical. Even if they may not speak the King's English, I know it used to be called the Queen's English, but the King's English now, They're very practical, and so what we do is we make an effort to have a menu of loans which range from 1,000 to 350,000. So obviously someone who's coming in doesn't have, the most reliable living situation, we will probably give them a small loan to build their credit. And that was the most, I guess something we had to learn ourselves, me being an immigrant, how credit and credit scores play such a big part in your financial day-to-day, financial transactions. So we focus on the things that we can provide them rather than saying, go back and, learn better English. Maybe they're going to rent, we give them 2,000 maybe to rent a chair, and, maybe they can do hair braiding. But we also make those large loans which sustain the program, and we're making those loans to more established businesses.
Thank you. That's actually great, because my next question was what are some of the strategies you're implementing? And that's such a great way to bring in more financial inclusion that can, again, benefit not just refugees, but the economy as a whole. And actually, I'll ask you that too, Selen. How are you building, through your work with Refugee Investment Network, how are you empowering refugees, and what are kind of the spillover effects of that?
Yeah, so what the Refugee Investment Network is working on is actually trying to overcome a systemic barrier here, which is that, a lot of sort of support to displaced communities happens through, donor, funds, through aid, through sort of humanitarian, interventions, which are, so crucial, and needed, obviously, especially in sort of acute, stages of the humanitarian, needs and crises. But, displacement is situations are so protracted, I think on average 17 years, something like that. So, at some point, quite quickly, what you need is the involvement of, the rest of the sort of economy and other sectors and the private sector and private capital. So what Refugee Investment Network is working on is what we call refugee lens investing. And we have a framework, if you're familiar with gender lens investing, modeled after that to some degree, which gives sort of, a categorization and a framework and tools for how investors and, impact investors specifically can advance refugee self-reliance and economic inclusion and financial inclusion through different types of investments. And refugee entrepreneurship, a lot of what we have talked about, is sort of one part of that lens, but so are, employers, hiring refugees, or impact enterprises that are creating, innovations and new products and services for displaced communities, organizations like yours that lend to refugees, and funds that, invest in other refugee-owned enterprises. So, the whole sort of universe of the types of investments that can bring capital and, resources to refugee economic empowerment and self-reliance in a sustainable way, and supplements and sort of maybe even picks up from where the initial humanitarian aid leaves to bringing in the private sector as well. So that's what we work on. That's our approach, and we do that as in a sort of intermediary role, basically working between the investors and the types of investment opportunities, the enterprises, funds, projects, and in a sort of broader field building capacity as well by creating these frameworks, sharing the tools and various playbooks, and doing the research, bringing data to the investors, creating the sort of the cases, like Accompany Capital, that show the refugees as opportunity, as contributors, as consumers, as employers, as borrowers, as renters, etc. So I can give more examples along the way.
Adding to what you said, earlier when we were sitting and chatting, I think all three of us, our paths have crossed. I'm very familiar with the good work HIAS does and what you do with Ren. Recently we've had about 4 or 5 banks approach us. We haven't approached them. They've come to us. They've looked at our financials, and they're very pleased with what we're doing. So one bank, TD Bank, they said, look, we're very impressed because, there's no grant right now, but there's just a loan. Because one of the sort of projects we've sort of embarked on, I would say for the last year is, as you all know, the New York taxi medallion sector suffered greatly with the disruption of, Uber and Lyft entering the market. There was chaos and, these taxi medallions that at one point were priced and sort of value was at 1 million. Suddenly they were like under 50,000. And some taxi drivers even committed suicide. So New York City set aside some money to refinance those loans. But there was no CDFI that stepped up. But we were very happy to step in because actually these loans were fully secured. And many of these taxi drivers, with our help, we were able to refinance the loan. So, overnight, someone who owes like $650, suddenly they only owe $95,000. So the impact, and what we're trying to do is not just make our loans a financial transaction. We want to see greater impact. And TD Bank was, they came to us, they said, we like what you're doing, and we'd like to lend you some more funds so you can make more of these loans. So in the same way, Starbucks Foundation, they've just invested in our loan fund at 2%. So we have a number of other deals. So getting back to what I said, obviously it's, for financial inclusion, diversity, everything we do makes sense, but it's also good business. And it's good business not because we're such experts, but because our clients are so fantastic.
Thank you so much, Yanki. And that was such a great example of collaboration happening between like private and public and banking and all sorts of sectors, and how that can feed into like empowering refugees, but also being a great way to kind of invest in businesses and people. So in some ways, my next question is again a question around that. Like, all three of you are handling the refugee empowerment field in so many diverse ways. And how do you envision kind of collaborating? And from your experience, how have you collaborated with different sectors? And I know HIAS, for example, collaborates a lot with the government and different institutional partners to support and empower refugees. And maybe I'll start with you, Sarah, and then we can go around.
Yeah, so we definitely collaborate primarily with the government through large grants for refugees. Currently, actually, we just sent an application from a Department of Commerce grant, which we've never worked with the Department of Commerce, but I think some of you might know that there's a large act in 2020, maybe 2019 maybe, but that came out for digital equity. So we are actually working with Department of Commerce, hopefully, if we go forward on a digital literacy grant. But in terms of, private sector, public, for us, it's a lot of employer focus, right? So when we, the program I work on is called Refugee Career Pathways, and it's in 3 cities. And when we build capacity at these social service organizations to have like program coordinators who are working on behalf of their caseload, of their clients, career counseling them, doing the upskilling that I mentioned to get them to the English skills and digital skills, but also constantly contacting employers and educational institutions and vetting them, also explaining to them. So there's a lot of misunderstandings among employers, and the places where I'm working, San Diego, Ann Arbor, and Philadelphia, they're not too bad, but there are some cities or states that are even a little bit more having like a little bit of a negative lens or attention about are we hiring illegal people? Do they have correct documentation? And to be clear, like refugees are absolutely, they're authorized to work from the very beginning. So that's a complete misunderstanding. Then sometimes there's even some challenges where when we have these case managers, when we have these coordinators on the ground, there's sometimes, if there's cultural challenges at work, they're a perfect intermediary because these case managers are meeting with them, once every week or two anyway. So let's say a manager is having a cultural challenge that they don't know how to navigate. Maybe they even need help with the language barrier. They can go straight to the organization. These organizations are like so helpful in the sense that, they can communicate to them and say, this is what's going on. Like, we'd love your help to do this right and do this respectfully. And of course, like these refugee organizations have such a high level of expertise, the people on the ground, when they have access to excellent translators, they have the cultural competency and knowledge to navigate maybe a challenging conversation. So yeah, the work we do and the social work side of this work, like these case managers, these care counselors who are meeting every single day, working through these barriers that we described, that is such inspiring work, honestly.
Yeah.
Just reminded me of something. I should have taken better notes and prepared. So there's a lot of collaboration going on, and the most recent and successful one, there was one with New York City government, Goldman Sachs, MasterCard, and they selected, I think there were 5 or 6 CDFIs, and they provided the capital. And it was like about 57 million. We made the loans, and they purchased the loans. So we only had exposure of 5%. And the program also included some grant funding. And it was amazing because we learned so much from our peers, these other CDFIs who had more experience than we did. And I know it's really, sort of made MasterCard and Goldman Sachs, think about future collaboration with CDFIs because they saw there was, so much potential and the positive impact in the loans that were made. So I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity between the private and the public sector going forward.
Thank you. Selen.
I agree with all of this. I'll just add very quickly how essential it is because, the sort of the NGOs, let's say, or the humanitarian sector, or development organizations working on refugee livelihoods, for example, or economic empowerment. Well, they very much need the employers. They need the the private sector, and those linkages are crucial. But then on the flip side of it too, we work with enterprises, for example, through what we call Refugee Lens Investing Technical Assistance, which investors can also utilize, for their portfolio companies to help them become more refugee inclusive. Those companies, even when they intentionally want to employ or source from more, refugees, need those connections with refugee-led organizations, with the refugee communities, to be able to recruit, to be able to, really respond if they're developing a new, financial product, to do that based on the actual, needs of those communities. So, those linkages are crucial, and this is happening, on a sort of localized level, case by case. I can give many examples, but even at sort of like the global level, IFC and UNHCR have something called the Joint Initiative. UNHCR, the UN, Refugee Agency, and IFC, of course, International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, focus very much on private sector development, right? And that's a great example of, how these sort of collaborations are happening because they're really, necessary.
I'll just add, there's also a lot of innovation going on among CDFIs. At the conference, we just announced we're the second CDFI to offer a life insurance product to all our clients. So going forward from, what day is today? Is it 26th? Or, yeah. So I think from 2 days before, when we announced and we issued the press release, any client that comes to us for a loan, whether it's $2,000 or $350,000, has the option to opt in for a life insurance product up to $50,000, and it's at no cost to them, and they can select the beneficiary. Obviously, if they're in an accident, they get a certain amount, but if something terrible happens, at least the family will be taken care of. And it's very affordable for us. And also, research from the first CDFI that offered this product shows that because the borrower is so incentivized to, keep this insurance, there's actually a much better repayment rate. And also insurance companies are also now very curious and eager to fund and sponsor us. So we may end up making a profit from this product.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing, Yanki. So I think we have time for some Q&A. My last question before we open up the floor for Q&A is, a lot of us here are kind of students and young professionals who want to be involved with work that can be socially responsible and help marginalized individuals become more empowered. So just super quick, what advice do you have for us to kind of, for the next chapter of our lives to kind of step into this world? So whoever wants to start, go ahead, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A.
So I think, the keynote speakers, Anthony, he used to be at NFF, Nonprofit Finance Fund, and the person from, I forget his name, sorry, from Ford Foundation, they gave really great advice. So what I can say is there is a lot of opportunity in the CDFI sector, and I think the compensation is much better than when we first started. Literally, I mean, I can't, I won't go into detail, but we somehow survived because we believed in our mission, and so there's a lot of opportunity there, a lot of opportunity for innovation to do exciting work, and I have to say, I feel so fortunate because it's almost like every day there's something exciting happening or some exciting story about our client. 2 weeks ago, suddenly we got a grant of $5 million from Mackenzie Scott. And it was like, wow. And they said, look, you guys were recommended for this grant because of the work you do. So there are a lot of people out there who really believe in the CDFI sector. And then there's a lot of money coming down the pipeline from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lack of, professionals who can do this work in the CDFI sector. So I tend to be very optimistic most of the time, but I'm very optimistic for opportunities for all of you.
Do you want to? Freshest graduate
career development expert go first. I think it's a better question for Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's complicated. I wouldn't necessarily, all of you should apply to resettlement work necessarily. I think that's up to you. Exactly literally what she's talking about compensation. Yeah.
I couldn't do it.
So I'm not necessarily saying that I think you should go and work in this field that is underpaid and that unfortunately, like this election's coming up, we're all terrified. So I'm not saying to do that. But I would say like the small things you can do, for example, supporting refugee businesses as customers, also like mentorship. There's so like within your communities, wherever you are, there are refugee resettlement agencies that would love you to mentor like 2 hours a week, 2 hours every 2 weeks, career mentorship, digital skills mentorship, like whatever they need or whatever you can offer. And that type of thing, that feeds your soul. Like that type of impact that you can make on one person's life. And honestly, when you are mentoring one person, they often are spreading to their community. Like let's say you're talking to a Haitian person or an Afghan person, they're going to when they become leaders in their own way, they will give back what you gave them. So it's like a reverberation. So definitely, I think volunteering, nothing too hefty. This might even be virtual in terms of the mentorship, but volunteering is a great way to get into touching this work.
Okay, I'll just add one thing to that. I guess, because all of you are, or some of you, most of you are business school students here and interested in finance, interested in, capital for good. And I'm representing Refugee Lens Investing, right? So I'm here to tell you there are a lot of sort of impact investing, career opportunities in this space as well, at this intersection of investing and refugee impact. And it's a growing area, but it's an area that also requires a lot of innovation in the sort of types of financial products that are needed, in the way that different sources of capital are brought together. So, I really encourage you to, explore this area, and then, bring into it not just your technical skills, but through things like your volunteer experiences and, mentorship, etc., your actual understanding of the refugee communities and your, proximity to those communities as well. So.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for sharing your insights. And we'll open the floor to more questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending. So we received 8 questions. The first one being, how does your organization address refugees' limited financial knowledge, leading to fear and hesitation in utilizing financial inclusion services?
I can go first. Yeah, I really wanted to make sure I touched upon it, so glad you asked. So I would say the other barrier that I should have covered is financial literacy, and I'm sure they'll cover this too. But, in general, I want to shout out the adult learning, especially in a context, considering a context that you are forced to leave your country, okay? So you're not in a great state of mind anyway. Adult learning is really hard. There's a sense of shame sometimes around not knowing some basic concepts. Like, for example, credit. Credit is an extremely American thing. So why would they even be able to understand that? Like, there should be no shame. But unfortunately, our brains sometimes tell us things. So we have a really excellent financial literacy product that is a curriculum. It's like, I forget the word for it. It's like a web course, like ready to go. And it's translated into, I think, 15 languages, which that's the key word. There's tons of financial literacy products out there, but not all of them are translated in the languages, like Burmese, for example, and you would want to be like this kind of stuff. You would want it to be in your target language. It's too complex for it to be in the language you're learning. But credit, borrowing, saving, and even like aspects of creating a business are in this course. And it's also flexible. It's e-learning, which, by the way, e-learning is great, but it also comes with its negatives, right? If you're, like I said, if you're a very busy person working your 50-hour week, taking a bus to work, you might not feel that you're motivated enough to get on e-learning, but the alternative, which is like in-person classes, also has its negatives because you need transportation, you need, a lot to sort of show up the kind of time that you would need. So in general, financial, literacy and knowledge is a huge barrier, and we're definitely at HIAS really focused on trying to solve that.
Yeah, so Accompany Capital, we, apart from the staff speaking, 14 languages and dialects, we, of course, translate all the materials that were specially prepared with our clientele in mind. But I'll be quite honest, I'm sure many times, they're not reading those materials. So we have classes where we tell stories, and I'm not saying Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but very often many of them know previous clients, or because 60% of our new clients are through referrals from existing clients. And there's one story that seems to resonate a lot with our clientele. Asetoba, she had come to a loan officer with her son, and he was studying to be an accountant, but while he was studying, he was driving for Uber and Lyft. He needed to lease a car so he could pay his tuition. And the loan officer said, hey, Aseto, you have very good credit score, because, she had been in our program and we had given her credit builder loans. So if you guarantee the lease, your son is going to pay half of what he's supposed to. And it was quite a lot of money, like $400 to $600 of difference. And what that meant was he had to pay less, he had more time to study, and he was able to graduate and get a better job. So, examples like that seem to really resonate with our clients. And also when they have instructors from their community, there's a certain way they can speak to them. So certain things I couldn't say in English to them, it might sound rude, but one instructor will say, he's from Liberia. And he was actually a resettlement officer. We enticed him to come and work for us, and, we trained him. And he'd say things like, this is as important as your green card, and I'm like, really? And somehow it seems to resonate with them. So the other thing is, when they come in for a loan, we have their full attention. Because, they're just the same as you and I. When we want something, then we give something our full attention. So during that time, the loan officer, looks at their credit, explains everything. They might offer them a cup of tea, and then, one story one of the loan officers, shared with us is he noticed this client was, checking his bank account a lot, sometimes like 7 or 8 times a day. And he was going to an ATM, and each time you check, there's a fee, like $1.50 or something. He said, "Why are you doing that?" Excuse me. And he said, because every time someone purchases something and I, run the credit card, I run to make sure, the deposit went through. So then that's, it's at that point, the loan officer said, I set up an email address for him. I showed him how he can use his phone, and check to make sure the deposit went through. So it's very important for us to be practical and really meet the client where they are. We have a client who graduated from Harvard. He doesn't need to be taught, how to, set up an email address. And we know the payments for the big loan to that person is going to come in on time, and that subsidizes the other work we do for our other clients.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, please join me in congratulating the panelists and come here if you have any questions.